if I had to predict, I believe we're kind of at the top of that curve. I feel like we've been at the top of that curve for 6 to 12 months now. Typically, historically, the top of that curve lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 months. In this case, I think the top of that curve, we're already 6 to 12 months in. We could be there.
Hello and welcome everyone to the the Multifamily and More virtual meetup. This is an interactive podcast where we bring you, all of you wonderful, wonderful people, members and non-members alike, high-level people, high-level guests to interact with that you normally probably wouldn't be able to on the subjects of real estate, mindset, or anything in between. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just 1 second, but I have 2 quick orders of business. First, I want to just advertise, I guess I could call it a sponsor for this evening, is going to be a really cool networking opportunity in Detroit, October 24. Thanks to City Club Apartments for providing the venue. We've got this great high-rise building, top floor, clubhouse, where we can overlook the city, and I'm going to have everyone there, all the brokers, all the bankers, everybody you need for you to get connected with. Whoever it is in multifamily or really any asset class in real estate will be available to you. We'll have appetizers, beer, wine, all included. It is a limited space opportunity. It is $25 a person. My partner will drop the, look at him, all over it. We'll drop the Eventbrite link in the comments here. So anybody that's going to be or is in Michigan for October 24, please feel free to drop in to that event. $25 a person. Again, you get food, drink, and plenty of networking with everyone in the business pretty much. So come join me. I'd love to see you all there. Can't wait for that. And again, thanks to City Club Apartments for the venue. Second, I felt compelled. In fact, I wondered about whether I should even do this podcast tonight. I felt compelled to bring up the fact that today's a very solemn day in our nation's history, being 9/11. And really where I go with that, being a native New Yorker especially, where I go with that, first and foremost is to any of you that have served or do serve in the military or as a first responder or any of your family members, I wanted to offer a hearty thank you, honestly. I remember right where I was 9/11. Jay, I'm sure you do as well. And most people on this call do, although there are some that may be young enough, which is crazy to me not to remember. That's how fast time flies. So I remember right where I was. I remember how scary and creepy that was, and to think and see those images of people running into the buildings and just sacrificing their lives for other people, and then later with all the conflict that we had as a result, sacrificing their lives for our freedom. Very, very much compelled to say thank you to all of you. I know Matt Sieber, Phil Capron, if you guys are out there, 2 guys in the group that have served and are at least one of them is a first responder. So big thank you to all of you, and just to honor those folks tonight. So that's 9/11. So I don't know how to segue from that, Jay, but I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to introduce Jay here. So Jay Scott, you guys all know him. He is an entrepreneur, investor, and co-host of the BiggerPockets business podcast. In the past 10 years, Jay and his wife have bought, built, rehabbed, lent on, sold, and held over $50 million in property all around the country. Jay runs the popular website 123flip.com. And is the author of 4 books on real estate investing, including the best-selling The Book on Flipping Real Estate. So Jay, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Jamie. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate everybody that's tuned in. We've got a lot of people here, a lot of Michigan people here. I love Michigan. I did a lot of real estate actually next door in Milwaukee for a couple of years. So I spent a little bit of time in Michigan. I like Michigan.
Nice. We're going to dissect that a little bit. So as far as how this works, everyone, you have the chat, you have the Q&A. The idea of this is you have Jay Scott. Ask him the questions that you want to ask him. He's here to answer them. Our topic that we're going to focus on is the economy and just kind of what it takes to protect yourself as we move forward. But doesn't mean we can't have questions outside of that. Again, we could talk about some habits, mindset. I've got a bunch of stuff I could ask about, but I want to defer to all of you and get your questions in here. So fill it up. And again, let's warm up that chat box a bit. A few of you have already posted where you're from. Those who have just joined, I'd love to hear where you're coming in from. I see Michaela Bayer, I think Vancouver, Canada. So we've gone international, which is great. But say hi, throw in where you're from. Jay, there's a question here about what area of Florida are you in? I thought what I would start with is I gave a short bio. Why don't you give us a little bit more about you? Because you've had a pretty storied past. excuse me, that's led you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So my wife and I actually didn't start out in real estate. We were in the tech world. We lived in California for a long time. My wife and I met in California back in 2006, dated for a couple of years. 2008, we decided to get married. And when we decided to get married, she was working literally like 80 to 100 hours a week. I mean, she was doing the corporate jet thing. She was right-hand woman to Meg Whitman at eBay. So she was doing the high-powered thing. I was working, I was at Microsoft, and I was doing the 60, 70, 80-hour a week thing. I was traveling a couple of weeks a month. And so we never saw each other. We were working all the time, and it really wasn't a lifestyle that was conducive to having a family. And we were both getting up there. We were both in our mid-30s at the time. We were ready to start a family. So we said, one of us has to leave our jobs and kind of raise the kids. I mean, we can't both be doing this. And I think at the same time, we kind of both decided, why one of us? Why not both of us? So it took about 10 minutes to make the decision once we decided to get married that we were both just going to leave our jobs. We were going to figure out what was next. But the most important thing was we were going to put our lifestyle ahead of our business. We're going to put family ahead of money. And everything we did was going to be focused around the family. So 2008, everybody remembers 2008, February 2008, we had just given notice at our jobs. And it was February of 2008. The day after I gave notice at my job was the big stock market crash back in February of 2008. That's when the downturn started. We had already decided that we were going to head to Atlanta, Georgia. It was on the East Coast, closer to family. We didn't know what we were going to do yet, but we were going to head to Atlanta. We were going to do something entrepreneurial, start a business, do something. And so we get to Georgia around May of 2008. The economy had tanked. Georgia was probably one of the hardest hit areas in the country. I mean, everywhere you went, just foreclosure signs, like drive down the street, 7 out of 10 houses had like for sale or foreclosure signs on them. So we're in Atlanta, we're getting married in August, and we're spending the summer. We said, we're going to take the summer off. We're going to just kind of figure out what we want to do next. And my wife's sitting on the couch in the basement one summer morning in 2008, and she's flipping through the channels, and she sees HGTV, and she said, let's flip a house. We don't have anything to do before the wedding. This was like a month before our wedding. And she's like, let's just flip a house. Like, yeah, it'll take a week or two, and then we'll get married. And I didn't know enough about real estate or anything to argue with her. And I was like, okay, great. Let's flip a house. So I spent the next month or so trying to figure out what I needed to do. We started looking at houses. We started talking to, turned out to be unscrupulous wholesalers, trying to find houses. Long story short, we purchased our first house the day we got married. So we closed on the house the day we got married. And luckily, we actually found a couple houses at one time. We found 3 houses at once. And so in the first 2 weeks, we closed on 3 houses, which is a good thing, because had we just closed on the first one, we probably never would have done a second or a third or a fourth. But we closed on 3 houses in the first month. First one didn't go well, but the second 2 went okay. And we just rolled from there. And before we knew it, we were flipping 25, 30, 35 houses a year. People were asking us about flipping houses, which was crazy, because literally before we bought that house, I knew nothing about real estate, nothing about construction. And then here we are 10 years later. We flipped a few hundred houses. We've gotten into to rentals. We've done some multifamily. We've done some mobile homes. We do notes. We do lending. We do a little bit of everything. And I don't think of myself as a real estate person. I think of myself as a business guy, because probably half the people on this chat right now know more about real estate than I do. So I'm good at business. My wife is good at business. We figured out how to run this like a business. We surround ourselves with really, really smart people. That's the key. But half the people out there that are listening to this, you're probably know more about real estate than I do.
So there's a couple of questions rolling in already, but I jotted down a few things. One quickie. Why Atlanta? I'm just curious.
Good question. We made a list. We had some criteria. We made a list, and we said it had to be a certain size city. It had to be a certain distance from each of our families, had to be near a major airport. We wanted certain like demographics. We wanted certain business demographics, like certain types of industry. And it boiled down to Charlotte, North Carolina, or Atlanta, Georgia. My wife had lived in Charlotte for a long time and said, I don't think you're going to like Charlotte. Let's give Atlanta a try. And neither of us had had ever been there before, but we said, okay, let's do it. So it was just an adventure.
Gotcha. The next question I have kind of parlays into a question that's on here. One of the questions that's on here. So you mentioned about leaving your job. So I'm inherent in being an investor, in my opinion. I mean, I think this is fairly obvious. Is a quest for financial freedom, right? It just is. Most people are doing this specifically for that reason. Not like I'll still retire at 65 and whatever, but some may. But for the most part, people want to walk away. You walked away before you had any kind of established business or whatever the case may be, right? Can you talk me through, like, what's that look like? Did you have a level of preparedness before you went, or was it a leap of faith? Is there a mindset thing in here, some personal development work that you did? Like, can you just walk me through that decision? Because I think that's important for me and for a lot of people.
Yeah. So there are a couple things at play here. One, I mean, just to be totally honest, I don't have the story that a lot of people have. I arrived in Atlanta. I had 3 cents in my pocket. I didn't have a place to live. I was living. That wasn't me. That wasn't us. We were fortunate. We had the corporate jobs. We made good money. We saved some money. So we got to Atlanta, and we weren't in a situation where if we didn't get a paycheck for a couple months, we were going to starve. So we had the luxury of figuring out what we wanted to do, figuring out how to do it. If we had a failure or two along the way, we could have kind of gotten past that without major catastrophe. That said, we were in our mid-30s. We both came from the tech world. The tech world, for anybody that knows it, is quite finicky. You leave it for a year or 2 or 3, and it's hard to break back in because everybody thinks of it as there's a million big companies out there, but it's really a tight-knit industry. Everybody kind of knows everybody, especially when you get up into senior management. And so I knew that we basically had 1 or 2 or 3 years to figure something out before we both kind of locked ourselves out of that industry. So there was some stress there. We knew that we had a couple years to either figure it out or go back. And we also knew, again, with the tech industry, it's a very young industry. And so we knew if we tried to go back at 38, 39, 40 years old, there was a good chance people just weren't going to want to hire us. We were just past that age. So we did have some good things going for us. We did have some cash saved, but we also had that time pressure of if we don't figure this out, we're getting older. We need to have an income. We can't retire at 35. So yeah, it was that combination of things.
Okay. No, that's good. That's interesting. That was a question that popped up here for a second. So, and I have one other question, but I'll hold it because there's a question in the group that I think naturally flows from this from Melody, I believe, that says, how'd you buy or finance 3 houses without a job?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question. It's interesting. I think I learned a lot about real estate in the first several deals we did because the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, I'm trying to remember what our 6th deal was, but at least the first 5 deals, we did 5 different sources of financing. So the first deal, we paid all cash. In retrospect, that was a mistake, but we were like, hey, we have the cash for this. It was like $70,000 and another 40 or 50 for rehab. I'm like, okay, let's just pay cash. That way we don't have to worry about mortgage payments. We don't have to worry about owing people money. But like I said, we found 3 properties all at once. So we didn't want to put cash into all 3. I don't remember at the time, like if we had enough free cash to do that. So we had to find another way of going. We couldn't go to a bank for a traditional loan. We didn't have jobs. So as anybody that's in this business without a job knows, you need a couple of years of solid income and tax returns before a traditional bank's going to give you a loan. Sure. But we did learn about portfolio banks, portfolio lenders, so small local banks that don't have the underwriting criteria that's set by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the government. So we got really close to the portfolio lenders in our area, and we started working with small local banks, went to a hard money lender, went to a private lender. So each deal is like, okay, what am I going to do next? And I kind of saw it as an opportunity to figure out all the different forms of financing. On our 5th deal, we actually used seller financing. And so that for me was a huge eye opener. Deal 4 was private money. Deal 5 was seller financing. And those 2 deals basically just opened my eyes to, wait a second, I don't need to use banks. I don't need to have my own cash. There are other ways to do deals, and I can scale from here. I can do 30 or 50 or 100 houses a year because there are people out there. Even if I don't have the money, there are people that have the money, and there are sellers that have equity that can lend me that money in the form of equity.
Mm-hmm.
So we bought the first 5 houses, 5 different ways. We even used, I think there was one house in there that we ended up using conforming loan, which I think the bank didn't realize we were flipping it. They wouldn't have given us the loan had they known that. They thought we were holding it as a rental. But anyway, we did a whole bunch of different things, but
you didn't give up is what it boils down to, right?
We didn't give up, and we tried different things, and we learned the benefits and the drawbacks of every different form of financing. And that's really taken us through the last 10 years, because what we learned in those first 5 deals, every deal we've done in the last 10 years has been a combination of those 5 forms of financing.
Sure. It's interesting. Yeah. Like you mentioned about the, a very quick point that we'll dive into kind of the core topic here, but you mentioned portfolio lenders. And I remember, so I bought a couple of properties in upstate New York where I'm, where some of my family lives at least. Yep. Small town. And it took like the 13th bank that I called before, I found the kind of product that I liked, which was a portfolio product. Yep. With all the terms I wanted, right? To your point, it wasn't that they had no standards like a typical bank, but it was a way different experience when they're loaning their own money. They're not looking to sell that mortgage, right? It's their cash. So I guess my point, like what you just went through was there's a way. If you're willing to be diligent and drive through it, there's a way, depending on what you're looking to buy. And I could speak specifically to the idea that, if you're looking for portfolio banks, they're out there. You just got to find them. If some banks are just looking to lend in a certain asset class, they're ready at that point. You have to, if what you have meets the product they're pushing, then game on. So just got to keep going with that. So, all right, there's a couple questions. I'll get to those, I promise, guys, but I want to get into this whole economic discussion, because this has been, this has been looming. It feels like it's just everywhere. Everybody's talking about, the coming this or the coming that, or I don't see it, or all these, bull markets don't die of old age, right? Like there's this whole range of what is to come. My understanding is that you have a full-on crystal ball, and you know exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. Am I correct?
Wow. I'd be sitting here in a much bigger house with much nicer clothes if that were the case. No, that is absolutely positively not the case. I think what I have is I have a good background in economics. I have a good understanding of what's happened historically with the economy and economic cycles. And I spend a good bit of time thinking about how history has impacted investors, and how I, as an investor now, can kind of analyze where we are in the cycle and use the information I gather to kind of make decisions on the types of investments that I want to pursue right now. And so that's all it is. I'm no smarter than anybody else. It's just a topic that I really love to dig into. I've studied it for a long time. And I look at the data, and it's nothing that anybody else could do if they wanted to do. I'm an economics geek, I guess you could say.
Yeah, no, I'm being facetious, obviously, with the crystal ball, but I guess I wanted to clear, nobody knows what will happen. Just to be very clear, Jay, not anybody, but to his point, he's reading tea leaves and seeing what historically maybe has happened to give an idea of what he thinks things look like, where they may go. I'm assuming what factors could take that one way or the other. So let's dive into that. I don't know how to ask the question other than like, what do you see happening right now? What are the indicators telling you? Is that a fair question? Or if you want to reword that for yourself, I have no problem without prognosticating, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Let's start with a little bit of backstory, because I think, I don't know if I take it for granted, or maybe a lot of people take it for granted, that there are certain givens that about the economy, but not everybody realizes it or has. Here's a big point. The economy works in cycles. We talk about like when the next recession's coming, how quickly it's going to get here, how long it's going to last. Occasionally I'll hear people say, do you think a recession's coming? Do you think there's going to be another recession? And maybe they're just wording it incorrectly, or maybe they really don't get the fact that it's not a question of if the next recession's coming. The next recession is coming. Now, is it coming tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now? Nobody knows. But the next recession is coming. The economy works in cycles. And if you look back historically over the last 160 years, there have been 33 cycles. Now, I'm not a math genius, but if you take 160 years, you take 33 cycles, you divide 160 by 33. And what you find is that we have an economic cycle, and an economic cycle is an uptick, a top, a downtick, a bottom, and then the start again. That full cycle, that's happened on average every 5.5 years over the last century and a half. So a lot of people think, because again, a lot of young people here, a lot of young people in real estate, a lot of people who didn't really pay attention to the economy until 2008. And here we are since 2008, it's been 11 years, and we're still in the midst of this economic expansion. We're still in the midst of this cycle. So a lot of people don't think back or weren't around before 2008 and don't realize that this is common. Having an expansion, having the economy go up and then having the economy go down and then up again, that's just something that happens over and over again. And typically speaking, it happens every 5 to 6 years. Now, over the last 50 or 60 years, it's lasted a little bit longer. It's been an average about 6.5 years. But what we've seen since 2008 is a real anomaly. This is the longest economic cycle that this country has ever seen. So certainly we can talk about, are there things that are happening in government, politics, monetary policy, fiscal policy that are influencing this cycle and dragging it out? Absolutely. There are probably things that are affecting. 2008 was a different type of recession than we typically see, so that affected it. So people talk about, is this time different? Maybe it's a little different, but long story short, the recession is coming. And after that, an expansion's coming, and then another recession's coming, another expansion's coming. And it's going to keep going for probably as long as this country is around. So that's the first thing I want to get out, is that the recession's coming. Now, second thing I want to get out is, if somebody tells you they think they know, or they think they can predict when the next recession is coming, I think that's BS. I don't think there's anybody, I don't care how long you've studied economics, I don't care who you are, nobody knows when the next recession's coming. The way recessions tend to work is that you get to some tipping point, and there's a confluence of factors that kind of come together that nobody really predicts, and that starts to snowball. Mm-hmm. And that snowball could have started 6 months ago, and we don't know. It could start today, it could start next week, next month, next year, we don't know. So I'm not going to try and predict. I know everybody wants to know, how long do you think before the next? I'm not even going to try and predict. I will talk about the things that are indicators that can give us an idea, but I'm not going to predict. And then the next question becomes, how bad is the next recession going to be, and how long is it going to last? The how bad question, that's a really tough question, because again, it's a snowball effect. And depending on what that snowball picks up as it's moving along, depending on all the things that kind of break in the midst of the recession, it could be really bad, it could be not so bad, and maybe we recover quickly and we push out some of the issues that we're currently seeing to the next recession. Maybe the next one's going to be a lot worse. In terms of how long it lasts, that one's actually a little bit easier of a question. And there is data out there that we can look at, that we can say there are certain things going on in the economy right now that will help us kind of discern what the length of the next recession might be. Is it going to be longer than typical? Is it going to be shorter than typical? So that's kind of all the backstory. So let's talk about, and I'm happy to go into that more, but I think I've probably beaten that horse enough. So let's talk about how we talk about where we are in the economic cycle. And again, we have the uptick, which we often call the expansion. We have the very top, which is, in math, we call that the inflection point. That's where we change direction. We have the recession, or the downturn, and then we have that inflection point at the bottom where we change direction again. I think most people would agree that since 2010, 11, 12, we've kind of been on that uptick. And then the question is, have we gotten to the top? Are we still going up, or have we gone over the top and we're starting to go down? And to discern that, I like to look at three things. First, we can look at the timing, and we've talked about the timing a little bit. On average, the typical recession lasts about 6.5 years these days. We're at 11 and a half years at this point. So from a timing perspective, we're overdue. Again, doesn't mean it's going to happen in the next year or 2 or 5. Maybe it's going to be a 15-year cycle. But on average, from a timing perspective, we can expect something bad to happen pretty soon. Next, observation, just looking around and saying, how do we feel? And a lot of times the term that pollsters use is consumer confidence or consumer sentiment. And so we can look at consumer sentiment to see how confident are we in the economy, how optimistic are people, is that optimistic still continuing to grow, or is it starting to shrink? There's been a lot of talk about the media and the way the media has influenced the economy and different economic data. And let me tell you something. I know it's a big topic right now where there are a lot of people who are saying, yeah, the media is out to destroy the economy. Every cycle, I remember 2001, 2008, 2001, the 90s, the 80s. I don't remember the 70s. But in every one of those, the media kind of latches on to the bad stuff early because they want to sell newspapers. They want you to tune into their TV shows. I know a lot of people think it's a political thing. I think it's just a media thing. The media is always going to look for the bad news over the good news. So certainly the media is going to influence the economy because they influence public sentiment, and public sentiment is a big part of what happens. If you think that we're heading towards a recession, you're not going to go out and buy that new car. You may not go buy as much investment property. You may not go buy a new house. You may not go put an addition on your house because you're concerned about your job. You're concerned about your wages. You're concerned about a whole bunch of things. So you're going to start spending less money. And if you spend less money and your neighbor spends less money and everybody starts spending less money, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The economy actually starts to do worse.
Sure.
So the second piece of it is that observation or consumer sentiment. The third piece is just the pure economic data. And that's the stuff I like. I like the data. And luckily, the government is really good at collecting economic data, mostly reliable. I know a lot of people question some of the data, and I question some of the data. I don't think it's that the government is trying to put out bad data, but the government is constantly changing the way they collect data and the way they analyze data. And so if you look at certain numbers, and there are different unemployment numbers, but there are a few unemployment numbers. If you look at the way they were calculating them back in 1990 and the way that they're calculating them today, if we mapped 1990 by the standards of today, the unemployment rate would be completely different. It's not necessarily that the government's trying to trick us. It's that the government's trying to get better numbers, and so they're changing the formulas. Okay, so what are some of those economic data that we look at? And let me preface this with what I'm seeing. If I had to predict, I believe we're kind of at the top of that curve. I feel like we've been at the top of that curve for 6 to 12 months now. Typically, historically, the top of that curve lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 months. In this case, I think the top of that curve, we're already 6 to 12 months in. We could be there for another 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, who knows? But I believe that the current expansion, and by expansion, I mean the current environment where the total output of the nation, the total expansion of the economy in various measures is probably over. Doesn't mean we're gonna crash or start moving down next week or next month. I don't know when it's gonna happen, but I think the next move is gonna be down before it's up again. But it could be lateral for the next, who knows? So what is the data that we look at to discern this? So big one that everybody looks at is GDP, or gross domestic product, and that's the total output of the country. So how much are consumers spending and businesses producing? And we talk about that number in terms of growth. We like to see that number grow every quarter. And typical growth for that number is between 2 and 2.5%. Now, beginning of 2018, we had some huge tax cuts. One of the goals was the tax cuts was to drive GDP up and drive growth up. Hope was we would get to 4 or 5% growth for a couple of years. In reality, we got to 3.5% growth. It lasted about a year. Latest numbers we're down to 2% growth again. Now, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, you can look at that and say, wow, in a year, we've gone from 3.5% growth to 2% growth. Everything's collapsing. The other side is going to say 2% growth. Well, that's pretty much average for what we've seen for the last 10 years. So how do you interpret that? It's up to you. I like to look at all this data. It's like a puzzle. Yeah. And you get one piece of the puzzle and you still have no idea what the puzzle looks like. You get 10 pieces of the puzzle, you get 1,000 pieces of puzzle. The more pieces you put together, the more becomes clear what you're looking at, what the picture of the puzzle is. And it's the same way with economic data. Just using that one piece of data I just said, nobody has any idea what it means.
Okay.
You mix that with 100 other pieces of data, and suddenly you're starting to form a picture. So GDP is one. And again, it's mixed. You can look at it as, hey, 2% is good, or you can look at it as it's 40% less than it was last year. That's bad.
Yeah.
So next, here's a big one, and we can talk about this for a few minutes. Somebody asked a question about what's the yield curve.
A couple in there. Yeah.
And everybody's talking about the yield curve these days. It's funny when we get to this part of the economic cycle, people start talking about the yield curve. Is it okay if I share